was recently fortunate enough to visit Drakensville, which is a hot pool resort up in the Drakensberg. And I met a delightful Afrikaans gentleman who hails from the town of Burgersdorp. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with South Africa and unfamiliar with the Eastern Cape, it would be fair to say that Burgersdorp is probably one of the driest places in the Eastern Cape. They spend their lives there praying for rain. I have spoken previously about our relief effort trying to send fodder and food down for livestock in Janssenville, which is not far from Burgersdorp. But this gentleman told me in the swimming pool the most fantastic story of the drought of 1960 in Burgersdorp, where the ministers of the four churches decided to hold a prayer meeting to pray for rain. And because they couldn't decide on the venue, they thought they might have it on the school rugby field, until one of them rather cleverly pointed out that oftentimes at a prayer meeting for rain, it can start to rain during the meeting, and perhaps an open-air venue was not the right choice. So they decided to have it in the largest church, which was the Dutch Reformed Church in Burgersdorp. School closed early that all the kids could attend, and people arrived by the 100 for the prayer meeting. And each of the four ministers was allowed to have his little say and a little prayer, and it would be finished off by the Dutch Reformed minister. And he got up to speak, and he asked these hundreds of folks, with all the children sitting down at the front of the church, if they'd come to the prayer meeting in faith. And there was a collective around the church that they'd all come there in faith. And he said, "Show me your umbrellas." And one dear little old lady put up a little black umbrella. Nobody else, out of the hundreds of people present, had bought an umbrella. And almost providentially, there was an enormous crack of lightning directly over the church and a huge clap of thunder, and it began to rain. Cats and dogs rain. So the folks sat in the church wondering about this heavenly event. Eventually, at around 5 or 5:30, we were obliged to go home, and all slipped out of the church, slipping in the mud minier to walk home. The women with their church hats plastered down over their heads. And I was just reflecting on what a magnificent story it was, told enthusiastically by this man who was a young teenager at the time of the happening, and how he had remembered that prayer service for rain for the rest of his life. Now, we are fortunate enough right now to be in the Western Cape on another road trip. We are coming to try and conduct the talks that were postponed, you recall, from early August on account of level 4 lockdown restrictions. And we came on that beautiful mountain road that comes around the top of Lesotho from Clarence to Vicksburg to Verriesburg, down to Klokkerlaan and to Ladybrand, and from Ladybrand across to the little settlement of Smithfield. And I want to tell you, the potholes on parts of that road were such that they left me with a rather nervous feeling after my events 2.5 years ago of hitting a pothole on the motorbike, smashing the front wheel, coming off and damaging very badly my left leg, amongst other injuries. Nonetheless, we got through the pothole safely, and we arrived at the little town of Betuli. Now, Betuli sits at the one end of the enormous Garib Dam on the Orange River, South Africa's largest freshwater reservoir. And Betuli is an interesting place because the hotel is owned by an eccentric gentleman called Anthony Hocking, who has over the years amassed a collection of 140,000 books and 80,000 vinyl records. So the hotel is adorned from the floor to the ceiling with shelves of books, thousands and thousands of books, along with these vinyl records that adorn the four walls of one high-ceilinged room. It is the most incredible collection, and Anthony talks about his journalistic past with great enthusiasm and hosts guests there with great aplomb. I was fortunate enough to go out with Anthony on a little historical tour around the town, and he spoke about the attempts after the Battle of Stormberg and Gattica's terror about coming across the Orange River into the Free State for fear of being smashed again by the Boers. And the Boers blew up the main bridge, the main rail bridge over the Orange River, and they were actually setting the charges on the wagon bridge adjacent to the rail bridge to blow up the wagon bridge that the British had no way of crossing from the Cape over the Orange River into the Orange Free State. Well, as things would unfold, the Boers seemed to delay a little in blowing up the wagon bridge, and eventually a young lieutenant called Popham, who just arrived, crept across the bridge and found on the near side, on the Free State side of the bridge, all the dynamite and the wires and the detonators and so forth for blowing up the wagon bridge. And without hesitation, he went back and collected men of his platoon, came back across the wagon bridge, grabbed the dynamite, the detonators, the charges and so forth, and then they took off running with their heavy loads back across the wagon bridge with the Boers firing at them with their Mausers. Well, they managed to safely cross the bridge back onto Cape ground and managed as such to save the wagon bridge. Now, this might not sound important to you, but what is interesting is that Roberts, in his march in the Boer War, had literally outstripped his supply lines. So he'd got to the Free State capital of Bloemfontein and was now not being supplied with food and, most importantly, medical provisions that they needed, because many of the men were succumbing to fever, enteric and cholera and so forth. Well, the British in 8 days managed to relay the railway line across to the old wagon bridge saved by Popham, laid tracks across the wagon bridge for one carriage at a time onto the near bank, hooked up that line with the main line through to Bloemfontein, and were literally able to save Roberts and his large gathering of British soldiers in Bloemfontein. But most poignant and moving for me was visiting the Butuli concentration camp. General de Wet called the concentration camp in Butuli die Moordkamp, the murder camp, or the camp of murder. It suffered more casualties than any other concentration camp in South Africa, 1,750 in total. To see the difference in the accommodation and the provisions between the hensoppers or the handsuppers, those who handed themselves over to the British, versus those who'd been forcibly forced off farms that had been torched and burnt, the livestock destroyed, was heartbreaking. And in it all, those 1,750 souls who perished there, many of them aged women and children, it was feared that the waters of the Gerib Dam would eventually cover the concentration camp. So those bodies were exhumed and moved to a new site on higher ground, and 1,400 square concrete slabs commemorate the 1,400 bodies moved. There are also another 350 to make the total of 1,750 who are commemorated within a closed-off area under roof with the beautiful sandstone headstones that were removed from their graves. Now, these folks were of little education, people who lived close to the earth, and the spelling on many of those gravestones is absolutely humbling. It's simplistic, it's childlike, of where people came from and indeed perished in the Butuli concentration camp. And I found the visiting of the new site with those sandstone headstones and the 1,400 slabs of concrete commemorating the souls who died there most moving, along with the women's monument that was never completed. British women put money together and wanted a monument put up at the Butuli concentration camp in solidarity with Boer women and children. The Boers, in a very complex political choreograph, felt that the British were gloating. So the memorial was never completed, no plaques were ever put up on it. And the memorial stands as a stark reminder to what happened in the concentration camps that began their lives as refugee camps during the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. And isn't it fascinating to consider that the deal for the Butuli Hotel fell through? Local planned to buy it and create a disco and fast food outlets and a hotel and a bit of a mall. And he couldn't raise the money to pay for the hotel. So Anthony Hocking was able to approach the liquidators and the auctioneers and put in an offer for the hotel and bought it, wondering what he'd do with it, because it was really quite derelict. And this was at the time of a swine flu outbreak in the Eastern Cape, and the police were managing roadblocks and blockades to prevent the movement of any pigs in and out of the Eastern Cape with the swine flu outbreak, and they needed accommodation. And they asked Anthony if they could rent the, at the time, derelict Butuli Hotel. And he said, well, if you can make use of it, you're welcome. And he thought it would be for a month or 3. Well, at the end of the month, they came to pay him in cash for the rental of the hotel, for the accommodation, and it went on for 17 months. Never mind the irregularities of the South African police services paying for accommodation of their folk in cash. In 17 months, Anthony Hocking had received enough income in cash to pay off the hotel, and the hotel was then his. And as tour groups and so forth began to visit Batuli, he was able to improve the hotel, put up the book and the vinyl collection and so forth, and it really is a very, very noteworthy place to visit in South Africa. Now, 5 weeks ago, my Antarctic contract was cancelled for this year, and I'd given up on going to Antarctica this year, and then out of the blue I got a request from another company I've worked for before to come down to Antarctica for the entire season. And I'm going to be leaving at the end of November for 2 months in Antarctica, which I'm looking forward to enormously. I'm going to have to work out how I'm going to create some stories for Patreon whilst I'm away, and I'm hoping too that you may follow the blog that I plan to write down from the White Continent, because it is the most beguiling, beautiful place. And isn't it wonderful to consider that South Africa was hoping last month in September to come off the UK red list in terms of British travellers being able to visit here and return without quarantine. Well, that was denied us, and we had to wait until the 7th of October for us to come off the red list. And there's a wonderful, wonderful meme doing the rounds on social media of "Kus lekker kerels, hier kom die teedrinkers," which basically in English means, "Aim carefully, men, here come the tea drinkers." Well, we cannot wait for the tea drinkers and the British guests to return to South Africa to enjoy the wonderful, wonderful offerings of our country, including the battlefields, the mountains, the bush, the beaches, the winelands here in the Western Cape, and so forth. You may recall my doing an interview some time ago with Steve Peel, the young microbrewer who set up the Shackleton Brewing Company in Cape Town. Well, on Friday night we were lucky enough to do that lecture live, all about Shackleton, in the Shackleton Brewing Company, amongst the huge wine vats and wine barrels. It was a triumphant evening. It was live streamed to folks all over the globe, many in England, many in South Africa, some in America, watching us tell the story of Shackleton in the Shackleton Brewing Company, where he in fact brews some of the beer out of water derived from Antarctic ice cores. And today, as we talk here to camera, we are on the magnificent wine estate of Grand Prevard in Franschhoek. It's a beautiful place with its art sculptures, its wonderful Cape Dutch architecture, and beautifully manicured vineyards. We gave a talk before lunch on the Battle of Isandlwana to an enraptured audience who loved it. I'm looking forward to more talks on this road trip, which I will share with you as they unfold. And most of all, I want to thank you for your ongoing support on this platform, and I hope you are enjoying a somewhat eclectic collection of stories as they come to us, and we are able, fortunate enough, to share them with you. Thank you all very much indeed.